Hello YouTube, this is Bryce here. There's been a fair amount of discussion around between certain nameable philosophers, I guess, on YouTube about the intersection of philosophy and science and the relationship. And a lot of it has been about, defending philosophy from, I don't know, what you may call scientistic worldviews, which essentially just maintain that science is everything and it'll solve everything. I'll come out and say, yes, I would definitely side with the philosophers against the scientismists in this case. But I wanted to talk about a more general, a more controversial claim, actually, about how science and philosophy are related. I would say that science is philosophy. Now, before I get around to defending that, I want to talk about why people might in the first place think science and philosophy are divorced, why they're not one and the same, essentially, why science might be better than philosophy and philosophy is useless. So I'm going to refer to this as the popular distinction. And the popular distinction will say, essentially maintains that the difference between philosophy and science is that philosophy, it's rational, sure. It definitely involves human intellect and thought, but otherwise it's non-empirical, it's vague, mysterious kind of, and it isn't useful. While science, it's rigorous and precise, and it's very useful. You know, for example, like, it cures diseases. It puts man on the moon. It allows people to get from LA to New York in 3 hours. That's what science allows us to do. So, before I go on to talk about why I think this distinction is false, I want to talk about the history, because the history is kind of interesting. And I think the reason for this distinction really goes back to the logical positivists in the 1920s and 30s. And it's actually rather easy to sympathize with the positivists. They're essentially a group of philosophers, and they looked around the philosophical world, and they found chaos. They saw that there were all of these philosophers for the last 2,000 years who had done nothing but come up with no agreement about anything, really. They were fighting over the same things, using the same arguments back and forth for the last 2,000 years. There was no progress being made. And so they said, well, philosophy, is it just shit then? And, well, there was another thing around. There was science. And science, at the time, whoa, science was amazing. Science was rip-roaring fantastic. And they said, well, look how successful science is doing. And, you know, there's a certain method to science. Well, doesn't that mean we can just make philosophy more scientific? Will that make philosophy better? Will that make it actually successful? Will that get philosophers to start agreeing with each other finally? I mean, gosh, you wouldn't have the same dispute over idealism, realism for the 100th time, or, you know, the dualists against the monists for the last 300 years getting nowhere against each other. I mean, you would get rid of these problems. You would have progress in philosophy. Finally. That was their idea. In fact, there was even, like, we'll call this a popular myth that really fed into it, of why philosophy and science were distinct, really. The example I'll use is astronomy. Astronomy used to be the domain of philosophy, essentially. In fact, any time you were making postulations about the world, it was always philosophy, no matter what. So you had this Aristotelian astronomy, which said that everything revolved around the Earth. The orbit of planets and the sun, of course, was perfectly circular, and the planets themselves were perfectly spherical. And of course, science came along and said, well, we can't reconcile these hypotheses to the data. It just doesn't fit what we actually see in the world. So that's kind of like the best example of demonstrating why philosophy seems to do best when it figures out how to not be philosophy anymore, but science. And that was kind of the idea of logical positivists. But I think the reality is that all that happened was they figured out how to do the philosophy correctly, just figured out the right method. Of course, that's the scientific method. And the scientific method is really based on philosophical claims, or I should say metaphysical claims that you can't have without philosophical justification. You can't get these foundational truths by which you're able to do science by science itself. That would be circular. It would be begging the question. And these foundational metaphysical premises by which you are able to do science are that the world is intelligible. You know, there are rational laws that explain the relationships between entities in the natural world. That we can really experience and think about the world. If I see an apple falling, it's because the apple is really falling. There's a true correspondence between my senses and the reality. And most importantly, that our descriptions about physical phenomena are meaningful. So what this means is that if I say that if I make this hypothesis, we shall see this. And that's really what the scientific method boils down to. It essentially comes down to the formula, if X is fact, then we will see at least Y. And if we don't see that, then it means X is false. That's how the scientific method progresses. It just says, if this is true, we'll see this. That's it. So we might contrast this scientific method to the philosophical method. And the thing is, though, there isn't actually a philosophical method that we might distinguish to the scientific method. Simply because there just isn't a philosophical method. It's too eclectic. It uses whatever it wants to use as a method to get to an answer to a problem. But what I think is important to understand is that there's this philosophical element within science. Because if one were to reject one of these metaphysical premises upon which one is able to do science, if we said that it doesn't matter if our descriptions about physical phenomena are meaningful, then a person could simply say, well, then I don't have to accept anything science says because, well, it isn't necessarily true that it's demonstrated X because we've seen Y. There doesn't have to be any necessary relationship between what we see and this sort of our conceptual account of it. So that's why philosophy is intrinsic to science. That's why empirical observation is just like a data, and then the philosophy is the actual thinking about that data, to give it an interpretation, to give it a rational description, a sort of mathematical accounting of it. So we might come down to this sort of comparison of uses about philosophy and science. Of course, science, excuse me. Science, of course, will put man on the moon and give us cures to diseases, because that's what it's studying, is it's studying these natural world phenomena. But philosophy isn't going to. Just because, well, that's not what it's studying. It's going to help you figure out things about, like, ethics and political philosophy and ontology and meaning. And especially, and this is the most important, it's going to give you things about the philosophy of science. It'll tell you how science works, how to apply science, when and when not a method is scientific. And science is really useful within the domain of science, of course, because that's what it's designed for by philosophy, but it can't give itself justification, because it simply can't go out in the world and observe the facts of these foundational metaphysical claims about reality. It's powerless to do that. It's impotent to do that. Because that needs to be interpreted out of the world by philosophy. So if you get rid of philosophy, you can't have science any longer. You can never do philosophy. You can never do science without philosophy. So that's why science is really a part of philosophy, because one is philosophizing about the natural world when they do science, essentially. They're just using a different method than maybe other philosophical domains. That's what kind of makes it different from the other philosophical domains. You have, ontology and ethics and philosophy of mind, and what distinguishes those domains within philosophy is simply the topic matter, the subject matter. While science studies the natural world, but what really makes it different is the fact of how it's studied. That sort of essential rule that if X is a fact, then at least we will see Y. I think I'll end this with a sort of analogy for helping to understand why it really isn't understanding how science is useful to philosophy to simply say, well, science put man on the moon and philosophy hasn't, therefore philosophy is useless. Well, this kind of, it's comparing apples and oranges, but really you might say it wouldn't be fair to compare a basketball player against a soccer player. You have a basketball player and you say, but he sucks at soccer. But it's like, so what? He's good at basketball. That's because he's a basketball player. And vice versa, the soccer player is really good at soccer, but not necessarily basketball. So I think that's really how we have to understand the interplay of science and philosophy, while remembering, of course, that science is actually a part of philosophy, and philosophy is intrinsic to science. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to make sure, is just that to demonstrate why science is philosophy, and you can't divorce the two from each other as if philosophy should be more scientific or science should be more philosophical. It's a meaningless sort of discussion to have if you're not first getting around to knowing how science is established by philosophy and what philosophy says about science. Yep, that's it. I'll talk to you guys later.